Okay, looking at GE's more intuitionism today, and this is moral non-naturalism. So if we break down the title of it, he believes that amorality is a non-natural property, which means you cannot find it within nature. Unlike moral naturalism, where they're looking at nature and say, yeah, we can see things that are verifiable within nature, and then from this is the way it is, derive a value statement, ought, the is ought scenario. He believes that morality is a non-natural property, and that is called intuitionism. So Moore agreed with moral naturalism that there is a moral good which we can discover, and it makes judgments about the world. Therefore, he is a realist and he is a cognitivist. But he disagrees with them on how we discover it. So if we cannot discover moral truths by observing natural facts, how do we discover moral truths? Perhaps the answer is that we just know what is right and wrong. It's an intuition. And this is what he says, quote from Moore. Beg it may be noticed that I am not an intuitionist in the ordinary sense of the term. When I call such propositions intuitions, I mean merely to assert that they are incapable of proof. I imply nothing whatever as to the manner or origin of our cognition of them. So essentially what he is saying is that he doesn't actually care where our intuitions come from. And this is what he is not discussing. There are many books that there are many philosophers out there who have tried to come to a conclusion as to what actually is our intuition. Where does it come from? How does it develop? All he is acknowledging is that we have an intuition and that this is what we use to discover moral truth. Now, he was a consequentialist. He believed that the moral value of an action was based on the good effects the act brings. But unlike utilitarianism, which is a moral naturalistic theory, he doesn't have this set of criteria in place saying what good is. And we'll come to the reason why for that later. More believed philosophers have been asking the wrong question. They should be asking, what is good? He came to the conclusion that it was undefinable. Trying to define good is what Kant tries to do. It's what utilitarianists try to do. So for utilitarianists, good is pleasure, happiness. For Kant, it's about doing your duty. That is what good is. But for Moore, that is indefinable. Now, that's going to obviously have its own problems later on. But he uses the example of yellow to back up his viewpoint. Try and define yellow. We just know what yellow is. We look at yellow and we go, that is yellow. But when you actually try and define what yellow is, it is an impossible job. G.E. Moore, I'd argue, that is an impossible job. And we just know yellow when we see it. So therefore, we know goodness when we see goodness. Now, Moore came up with the open question argument to back up his viewpoint. And there are three possibilities when he asked the question, what is good? So first of all, it's indefinable, or secondly, it is definable. Thirdly, good means nothing at all, and there is no such subject as ethics. Well, for the third one, he got rid of the third one really quickly. He didn't really discuss that at all because he did believe that there is goodness out there. But his argument was that actually good is indefinable, as we mentioned. And every theory tries to define good by making it equivalent to something. So, as I said before, that good in utilitarianism means X. So good means pleasure, happiness. Where X is some fact or set of facts. Good means duty, following your duty, if you follow Kantism. But is X really good? Now, that question makes sense. In which case, the X is in itself neither good or bad, because otherwise the sentence would not make sense. Utilitarians would argue that good is maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, but it still makes sense to ask, is it good to maximize pleasure and avoid pain? And the fact that this question makes sense means that maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain is in itself not good. So when we're talking about is X really good, it just highlights that actually maximizing pleasure in itself is not a good thing. And we know this is one of the criticisms of utilitarianism, isn't it? About you've got the 10 sadistic guards beating up the innocent prisoner. You know, and in terms of maximizing pleasure, the 10 sadistic guards are getting more pleasure than the pain that the individual is receiving. And so therefore, to ask, is this maximizing pleasure good? Most people would say, no, it is not good. So the question makes sense. And because the question makes sense, it means pleasure in itself is not good. So therefore, good in itself cannot be defined. It's an example of good not being able to be defined. So if good can be defined, he argues, he says, is this, let me get rid of that. If good can be defined, then asking the question, is this good, should not make sense. For example, use the definition of a bachelor being an unmarried man. It does not make sense to ask, but is an unmarried man really a bachelor? That question does not make sense at all. You are really asking, is a bachelor a bachelor? So what we have there, because you are trying to use the definition to in the question of trying to define a bachelor, and that's why it doesn't make sense. So moving on to the next slide, if the PowerPoint will let me. Yeah, he came up with another argument called the naturalistic fallacy. Now, the basic form of the fallacy is easy to understand. A term that is indefinable cannot be defined, and clearly that makes sense. Now, Bentham and Mill, they, through natural processes of psychological hedonism and our psychological desire to pursue happiness, it's in the American Constitution, Moore calls this a naturalistic fallacy because goodness is non-natural. Now, happiness is a natural property. Okay, that's why it's a naturalistic fallacy. Fallacy means error. It's a naturalistic error. Now, Mary Wallach disagrees with Moore's interpretation of utilitarianism. She believed that Mill was not defining goodness, but simply describing how people view goodness in that they pursue happiness. This is the case, then maybe Mill does not fall into the naturalistic fallacy trap. But I think most people would argue that Mill does fall into the naturalistic fallacy trap, because he isn't just describing, he is actually prescribing about how we should be behaving. So Moore has demonstrated you cannot define good. You just simply know what good is when you see it through your intuition. So for Moore, then, we come back to the question of what is good. Now, Moore's got a problem here, is because people always want to know what good is, to tell him what good is, but he can't, because then he falls into his own trap of trying to define the indefinable. Goods may all be said to consist in the love of beautiful things or of good persons. And Moore wrote in his final chapter, in this chapter about these things which he himself thought were good things within themselves. And lots of people really like the idea. But the problem is, who decides what is good? Who decides that his intuition is correct and somebody else's intuition is wrong? What if your intuitions clash? What if you don't think the love of beautiful things, or you think that different things are beautiful? Some people think opera is beautiful, some people don't. So, so how do we decide what is a beautiful thing and what is a good person? So it doesn't really answer the question. He's still drawn on that intuitional response of saying, yeah, but this is, goodness when you see it. Now, when intuitions clash, and this is where a lot of people really don't like, we can acknowledge that we have an intuition. We can all acknowledge that we have this intuition which tells us what is good or bad. But what Moore argues that when they clash, then you are wrong and he is right, because he has a highly developed sense of intuition. As you can imagine, not a lot of people like that as a response. You can't just tell me that you're right and I'm wrong. Basically, that's me telling you I'm right, you're wrong, because I'm older than you and I spent more time developing my intuition than you have. So therefore, I'm right, you're wrong. You're not going to be happy with that. And it is a very insecure way of making moral decisions. A related problem to this is that it doesn't really give a mechanism for when intuitions clash and for when bad things happen. Rudolf Hoss wrote in his man. Now, Rudolf Hoss, he was a part of the Nazi final solution machine. He was part of the group of people who organized the final solution in murdering 6 million Jewish people and 6 million political prisoners and communists and so on. And so after the war, in his memoirs, he wrote that he felt that what he had done was right. Now, Mill, using utilitarian principles, could demonstrate why Hoth was wrong, that what he had done was a horrific thing and should never be allowed to do. But for Moore, the only response that he would be able to give was that intuitions clashed with most of the people's intuitions. Now, if you're talking theoretically in a classroom, is it right to steal a loaf of bread to feed your family because they're hungry? You can have a debate about that. People's intuitions maybe clash. But if we're talking about the systematic murdering of 12 million people, then surely you are going to need a better mechanism than simply saying intuitions clashed. So that is always going to be a big, big issue with intuition. We can't ignore it, though, because we recognize we do have intuitions. We do use our intuition in making moral decisions. So we can't ignore what he is saying. And also, he is correct when it comes to we struggle in trying to define what goodness is. So to sum up, he was a realist like Bentham and Mill. He was a cognitivist like Bentham and Mill. So he was a realist. He did believe in a moral goodness that was mind independent and objective. And we can access this morality. And so therefore he's a realist. But he was also a cognitivist because you're making moral judgments about the world. He was a consequentialist, and because of this, some people saw him, he was an ideal utilitarianist. And then lastly, for him, good is a non-natural property, unlike Bentham and Mill. So you cannot gain goodness and work out what goodness is by looking at natural properties like psychological hedonism. It's a non-natural property. So that's why we only use our intuition to be able to access it. Okay, that's a very brief outline of intuition.